Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for standing by. Welcome to the Neuropsychology of Reading Disorders, a Framework of Effective Interventions webinar. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. If you would like to ask a question during the presentation, please use the chat feature located in the lower left corner of your screen. If you need to reach an operator at any time, please press the star followed by the 0. As a reminder, this conference is being recorded Tuesday, May 14th, 2013. I would now like to turn the conference over to Andrea Moss. Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. If you've attended the cause and effect sessions in the past, you know this series is all about why is my student struggling and what can I do to intervene. And for first-time attendees, just wanted to let you know that we do post the archives of these sessions, so you'll have that resource to refer back to, and it's also great to share with your colleagues who may have missed the session. Note on today's handouts, they were emailed via a reminder email yesterday, so if you did not receive those, please use the chat box to send me your email, and I'll get those out to you as quickly as possible. And with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Stephen Pfeiffer is a nationally renowned speaker and author in the field of learning disabilities and has authored 6 books on learning and emotional disorders in children. He has 19 years of experience as a school psychologist and currently works as a professor and research scientist at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. He is also a clinical supervisor in the ABS&P School Neuropsychology Training Program and maintains a part-time private practice at the Monocacy Neurodevelopmental Center in Frederick, Maryland. Dr. Pfeiffer was voted the Maryland School Psychologist of the Year in 2008 and awarded the 2009 National School Psychologist of the Year. In 2011, he was honored as the Distinguished Alumni Scholar of the Year by the Indiana University of Pennsylvania College of Education. Dr. Pfeiffer, we're so glad to have you with us again, and please begin once you're ready.
Thank you very much, Andrea. And hello, everyone. Welcome again to our Cause and Effect webinar series. This is installment number 4 over this past year in terms of looking at learning and emotional disorders in children. And today's topic is the Neuropsychology of Reading Disorders, a framework for effective interventions. For those of you who were with me in the fall, when we kicked off our Cause and Effect series, we also did a webinar on reading disorders, and the overarching framework of that webinar was more on looking at decoding and phonemic awareness. We looked at fluency, expression, automaticity, a lot of what you see in the blue and the yellow of those building blocks to reading on our first slide. Today's emphasis will be a very, very brief review, but we're going to spend 95% of our time looking at that pinnacle of reading. Today's focus will clearly be on reading comprehension. You see my email address on the very first slide, and that is the best way to reach me with perhaps any further questions that we are unable to answer during the course of this webinar. Many goals we want to address during our presentation today. We're going to start out, again, a bit of a review. We talked about this last time. For those who weren't with us in the fall, we will quickly review our 4 basic subtypes of reading disorders, and again, from a brain behavioral perspective. But what we want to really focus our discussion today is with subtype number 4. And that is going to be reading comprehension skills. That's going to be the focus of most of our discussion and interventions. We will talk about neural pathways. We'll talk about specific brain regions associated with reading comprehension skills. And perhaps most importantly, we're going to talk about the fundamental neurocognitive constructs needed to best derive meaning from print. And those constructs are going to lead us to the frontal lobes. We're going to talk about executive functioning. We're going to talk about working memory. And we're going to talk about the interplay between executive functioning and working memory and how that helps us, again, derive meaning from print. We will also get into language development skills because while language development is not housed in the frontal lobe, that's more of a temporal lobe type of thing in terms of vocabulary language skills is the frontal lobes that help us self-organize language for the purpose of to facilitate later recall. So we'll look at how all of these constructs, the interplay of all of these constructs, assist us in reading comprehension. As you know, with most of my webinars, I like to pride myself to go where no psychologist has gone before in the areas of interventions. And I mean talk real meaningful interventions. We will certainly be talking about a combination of classroom strategies to use for children who struggle with comprehension skills. But in addition, we'll talk about some of the prepackaged programs that you can use for children with disabilities, specifically reading disabilities and reading comprehension skills. So peppered throughout the webinar, we are definitely going to sink our teeth into interventions, and we're not going to save that until the end. It'll be embedded without our discussion today. Okay? That is the main focus of our talk. As always, much of the information we're going to talk about today and much of the information throughout the year with our Cause and Effect webinar series has come from our trio of books, Integrating RTI with Cognitive Neuropsychology, a Scientific Approach to Reading. Much of our talk today will be based on information in that book. We also did a webinar on mathematics earlier in the year, as well as a webinar on written language. For those interested in further information, www.schoolneuropsychpress.com, www.schoolneuropsychpress.com, and they are offering a deal for the 3 books. So just wanted to call that to your attention. I believe it's 3 for $99 is what they are offering. Okay. With that said, let us dive into our content. And I thought we'd start out with a few case studies. Let's start out talking about, before we get into the brain and before we get into constructs, how about we talk about kids? Kids that you see every day. How about Billy? Is Billy someone you see every day? Billy is a 12-year-old student, and Billy has an attention deficit disorder. Now, Billy needs accommodations in school because of difficulties with planning and with organization skills. He struggles to take notes in class. Billy also has a difficulty comprehending information from text and frequently turns in assignments late. So this is Billy. Billy has an attention deficit disorder. Billy struggles with reading comprehension. How about Sam? Do you work with Sam as well? See, Sam's 9 years old. Sam is a student with Asperger's syndrome, and his academic skills are pretty good, pretty strong, but he struggles to comprehend more abstract types of text, drawing inferences from print. Literal questions such as, what color is Billy's shirt? Well, he can find his way back into the text. Sam can answer a question like that, but questions such as make a prediction about what might happen next, more inferential, abstract questions, Sam will struggle with. Sam also has difficulties in the social arena. He doesn't have a lot of friends, seems socially awkward, maybe a bit immature in his social emotional skills and makeup. A lot of problems reading social cues from others. Does Sam sound fairly familiar? Maybe so. Once again, Sam is an example of a student who may have reading comprehension deficits. What about Joe? Anybody worked with Joe? See, Joe's in high school. Joe is 16 years old. Joe is busting loose with an IQ of 135. Okay, by anybody's standards, Joe would meet the criteria for a gifted and talented program. The only problem is while Joe's IQ is so strong, his academic performance is that weak. He's performing poorly in most of his classes. Joe does not put forth a lot of effort. In fact, rarely turns in assignments. Never turns in assignments. During class, Joe does not disrupt anybody. He just prefers to pull out a book, actually multiple books, and read them under his desk during most instruction. Joe struggles with comprehension on information that he has no interest in. Ever run across Joe in any of your schools? Well, one more for you. How about Martin? I think most people have seen Martin before. See, Martin's in 11th grade. Martin is 11 years old and just made the transition from 5th to 6th grade, as we talked about before. I think one of the biggest transitions, in fact, the biggest social-emotional transition you will make in school is the elementary to middle school jump, going from 5th to 6th grade. And Martin has a lot of difficulty in the area of controlling and managing his emotional impulses. You see, Martin's been suspended from school numerous times for fighting, for using inappropriate language. Martin's non-compliant. His grades are poor. A lot of interventions with Martin. A lot of behavior interventions. A lot of behavior plans. Still not having a lot of effect changing behavior. And as most behavior plans go, really don't focus on changing the underlying emotion. Among Martin's difficulty in school, Martin struggles with reading comprehension, sustaining his attention, and curbing his emotional impulses long enough to derive meaning from text. 4 children, 4 cases, 4 types of disabilities. The fact of the matter is, whether you have a disability or not, research has shown that up to 10% of all school-age kids, not just kids in special ed, I mean all school-age kids, struggle with reading comprehension. In spite of having adequate decoding skills, adequate fluency skills, they struggle with reading comprehension. We're talking about ADHD kids like Billy, kids who are hyperlexic like Martin. No, Martin wasn't my hyperlexic. Sam was our hyperlexic student. You know hyperlexia. Hyperlexia pretty much can decode anything in print, but you struggle to derive meaning from print. Students who are second language learners. How about Joe? High IQ kids, very poor executive functioning. How is that possible? We'll show how that's possible shortly. Kids with social emotional disorders struggle with reading comprehension. Kids with lower verbal IQs and minimal vocabulary development struggle with reading comprehension. And the one processing skill that seems to permeate any learning disability, whether it's reading, whether it's writing, whether it's mathematics, tends to be poor working memory skills. One of the points of showing this discussion and beginning our discussion with these various cases is that when we think of reading comprehension, we just think of kids with learning disabilities. And as you look at the pie chart with learning disabilities, look, most children find their way into special education, 42%, because of a specific learning disability. And among those 42%, the big blue pie chart here, among those kids, 80% are there because of a language-based learning disability. That means they struggle with reading or writing, or in most cases, both. Now, my point is, it's not just kids with learning disabilities that struggle with reading comprehension. Kids with speech and language impairments, limited vocabulary skills, struggle with reading comprehension. The other health impairment domain, and we know primarily who constitutes that domain, ADHD kids. They struggle with reading comprehension skills. Kids with intellectual disabilities struggle with reading comprehension skills. Kids with emotional disorders struggle with reading comprehension skills. Kids with autism, hyperlexia, Asperger's syndrome, something in the autism spectrum disorder, struggle drawing inferences and meaning, especially as texts become more abstract. The point is, all children, I'll back up, most children with disabilities, no matter what the disability, it tends to affect the area of reading comprehension. And all of the children that I talked about in terms of our case studies, none of them were learning disabled, but they had other disabilities. And one of the things I want to explore is how do those other disabilities affect the area of reading comprehension? Well, the only way to truly tease that out and to really pull out and provide us with a framework, an overarching framework, to me, to understand how we derive meaning from print and really to understand learning in general, is I've always taken a school neuropsychological approach. Looking at learning from a brain behavioral perspective, for me, has always taken much of the mystery outside of some of the behavioral phenomena I see with kids trying to learn information. A neuropsychological approach to assessment simply tries to identify what's the core underlying process responsible for learning, as opposed to boxing kids into diagnostic categories. I talk about this a lot with my current students, simply saying a child has Asperger's syndrome, or a child has autism, or a child has a learning disability. That is not the end point for an assessment. That's a label. It's time to go the next step beyond the label. What are the core underlying processes getting in the way of this child learning? You see, a report that is based more on a school neuropsychological framework, it's really based upon a brain behavioral paradigm that attempts to describe how a child processes information. The goal is not to get into fancy math and determine what this kid's full-scale IQ is. The goal is to determine why the child has not been successful in school. What neuropsych assessment tries to do is examine the cognitive and emotional strengths and weaknesses of the child. I've said this before, I'll say it again. Evidence-based assessments is the key to leading us to evidence-based interventions, and specificity with assessments to determine the underlying reason why this child is struggling. That will promote and lead to targeted interventions and, oh yes, an actual IEP. With a capital I, not the GEPs running around, generic education plans. You've read one, you've read them all. But to truly individualize an education plan, to format learning for a particular child, we have to know a little bit about, how they learn and what their strengths and weaknesses are to develop specific educational strategies. And the framework in which I do that is with neuropsychological assessment, and that's what we want to share here today. That's the paradigm. Now, whether you agree that that's the way to go, or you're thinking, that's overkill, who needs to do all this testing? My gosh, you can just do an observation and figure it out, or I still just want to give an IQ test and I'm good with that, or, we're an RTI district, we don't do a lot of testing. No matter what your feeling is on a neuropsychological approach, keep in mind what a neuropsychological approach is trying to do is survey higher cognitive functioning and determining the fundamental underlying processes in learning and trying to determine what's a strength and what's a weakness. It's a collection of information. I have always struggled, why would anybody be against trying to collect more information about a child if you could do it in a manner that would help us better understand the child and promote interventions? Well, no matter where you feel about the need to assess and the need to collect so much information, let me tell you what's embedded within the law right now. Now, a quick story. About 2 years ago, I was invited to go out to just a town just outside of Oregon, Forest Grove School District, and for all I know, we have some psychologists and folks with us today from Forest Grove. Welcome. Went out there as part of a group that was called the Meeting of the Minds. A lot of folks perhaps you've heard of in this, especially in this field. Myself, George McCloskey, Dawn Flanagan, Dan Miller, I believe Nancy Mather was out there. Can't remember if Brad Hale joined us for that or not, but we had a number of folks, and we were doing individual workshops, but collectively we were conducted a panel discussion and talked about the true nature of what a learning disability is. And why Forest Grove? Why were we out there? Because something pretty important happened in Forest Grove that I think people need to know about. And it goes something like this. A student, I believe at the high school level, had been struggling in school for many years and eventually was referred for an assessment in high school. Now, I was not privy to what the assessment constituted and what the specific tests were, but the more questions I asked, the more it sounded like it was one of those quick and dirty school psych assessments that were, well, for all I know, all of us. They could have, it could be any one of us who formed this battery of perhaps just an IQ test, a bender, a BASC, and let's call it a day. Okay, quick and dirty school psych assessment. And the student did not qualify for special education services. The parents were at the meeting. Apparently there was no real discrepancy. You've heard my thoughts on discrepancies before. There was no discrepancy between ability and achievement. And, parents signed off and said, okay, whatever. And you know how those meetings go. They can be rather intimidating, and you kind of comply. But after the meeting, the parents started to think, and it still didn't add up. It still didn't make sense. Nobody explained why their son was struggling in school. The focus of the meeting was only, does he qualify for special ed or not, and what's the IQ? Sound familiar? But no one explained why the student was really struggling. So the parents sought an independent evaluation, and this was an independent neuropsychological evaluation. And a lot of areas were surveyed that were not hit upon in the initial school psych evaluation. Executive functioning skills, memory skills, subtypes of attention. And I'm not talking about just attention checklists, but cognitive subtypes, selective attention, sustained attention, divided attention, shifting attention. A lot of things were looked at, and the neuropsych eval came back and said, we got some issues with this child. And there were some attention issues, there were some learning issues, there were executive functioning issues. They found the child had an educational disability. Well, the parents then went back to the school and said, aha, you see, told you. Obviously, they lost some trust with the school and pulled their child and sent the student to a private school that was rather expensive. They went back to the school district and said, you're going to pay for it. And the school district said, no, we're not. And hence the battle ensued. Eventually, a due process hearing officer was called in, and the due process hearing officer concluded that the school district failed to provide a free and appropriate education. And the school district was liable for private school services for a kid who never spent a day in special ed in this school. They're saying you're now liable. Well, the school district said we don't agree. It went back and forth. And why am I telling you about this case? Because it went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, right here, where I'm broadcasting from, just outside of Washington, D.C. I'm here in Frederick, Maryland. The United States Supreme Court, Justice John Paul Stevens, one of his last rulings on the bench before retiring in 2009, looked at this case and said, you know what? The parents and the due process hearing officer are correct. Justice John Paul Stevens of the United States Supreme Court ruled the school had overlooked a disability by not completing a more comprehensive evaluation in all areas of the suspected disability. Whether you agree or disagree, law of the land. We need to survey all areas, comprehensive evaluations, surveying all areas of a suspected disability. That means it would help us to really know what areas we're talking about. when there are reading issues or writing issues or math issues. And that's what a lot of our cause and effect webinar series has been about. So what we're going to talk about today is what those areas are with respect to reading, but more importantly, reading comprehension skills. Well, a quick review from our fall webinar. One of the things that we talked about in the fall were that reading, and in fact the essence of the entire webinar, is that when you look at reading from a brain behavioral standpoint, one of the things that helps me is that reading is about various subtypes. And let's fast forward to our brain here. And to describe each of the subtypes, we'll do a very quick review. But the one that's the most popular, I should say common, if you work at an elementary school, I mean, you get this subtype as well as ADHD is probably your two most common referrals, something called dysphonetic dyslexia. And dysphonetic dyslexia is that third or fourth grade student reading on about a first grade level simply because they lack decoding skills. That's subtype number one. Okay, it's the most common type of referral, kids who don't master that decoding phonological processing aspect of reading. So what do we have? And we looked at, let's see if my marker work, this sort of hierarchy of the brain right here. We're in the area of the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is the dominant hemisphere for learning. And just above our left ear is the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is a real marquee player in the area of reading. Now, while reading cannot be isolated or localized in any one area of the brain, there are multiple circuits that contribute. This area called Heschel's gyrus, well, speech and language therapists have a different name for that. They refer to this as auditory discrimination skills. This is basically hearing sounds and boundaries within sounds. And in the English language, we have 44 of these sounds. They're called phonemes. And the ability to hear whether two sounds are the same or they're different or if they rhyme. I mean, this is something that really should be mastered by age 5. This is what we call phonemic awareness, Heschel's gyrus. As we get pretty good on those sounds, we learn as we go up and to the back, up and to the back. The superior temporal gyrus is more of a cross-modal association area. The superior temporal gyrus allows us to take those sounds we're pretty good at distinguishing and link them up to a symbol, the alphabetic code, to understand that this sound goes with this symbol. So there is a visual component to the superior temporal gyrus, and it allows us to modulate, okay, those 44 phonemes because now we can isolate and identify a beginning sound or an ending sound or something like that. Very important in the reading process. But the highest level of phonological development is all the way back here. Let's go up again and to the back, up and to the back. This supramarginal gyrus, that represents the interface of the parietal and temporal lobes. The parietal lobes, spatial orientation and awareness. The temporal lobes are sound. The supramarginal gyrus is a big-time player in the spatial appreciation of sound. And as any good reading teacher knows, when you say cat, it's k-a. It's not t-k-a or a-k-ta. In other words, it's one thing to know the sounds, but this allows us to spatially manipulate and order the sounds. That's the highest level of phonological processing, and that we know in subtype number 1. Kids with dysphonetic dyslexia, something's gone awry on that whole sound structure, that decoding piece that goes from phonemic awareness to phonological processing. And we talked about interventions for that. Subtype number 2, our second subtype, was something called surface dyslexia. So if we go back one, we have surface dyslexia. Now the difference between subtype 2 and subtype 1 is on subtype 2, these kids have sounds. It's not a problem. Kids in subtype basket number 1, they're the ones who don't have the sounds. These kids have the sounds. What they lack is speed. These kids have difficulty with the rapid and automatic recognition of words in print. They over-rely on sounds. These kids are letter-by-letter readers. sound by sound. The kid in basket 1 who has no ability to sound out a word, if you show them the word cat, they're going to go couch. They look at the first letter, totally guess, totally let one fly here, because they have no idea how to sound something out. So they look at the first letter and over-rely on maybe visual cues and just guess. But the kids in basket 2, it's the opposite. They over-rely on sound cues. So they see the word cat, cat. Oh, thank you. Okay, good. We're getting somewhere. They have the sounds. What they don't have is speed. And the reason they don't have speed, more often than not, is they have poor orthographic processing skills. Orthography, the visual, sort of the spatial contour of shapes, of letters, and the contour of the letters allow us to sort of use some visual cueing to automatically recognize words, because the fact of the matter is, in the English language, 1 out of every 4 words is a phonologically irregular word. You know, whose bright idea was it to put the letter C in yacht? I don't hear it. So sometimes, because of the spatial configuration of words, we need to rely on that to identify words. Kids with surface dyslexia have the sounds, but they over-rely on them. They don't put the whole word together. And there's an area of the brain way back here, angular gyrus. It doesn't really look like this, but it kind of angles up the end of the posterior part of the temporal lobes that pulls in visual, occipital lobe, spatial, parietal lobe, appreciation of sound, the visual spatial appreciation of sound back here. And this is what really helps us with orthography. We also talked about mixed dyslexia, and that's the most severe subtype of dyslexia, and that's where you lack both phonology and orthography. So again, the kid in basket 1 with dysphonetic, that particular subtype, they're going to really struggle to decode words. The kid in basket number 2, they can decode. They're just really slow in doing so. They lack speed and fluency and automaticity. And one of the keys you see is they make a lot of errors on phonologically inconsistent words, of which 1 in 4 of our words are phonologically irregular. But the kid in basket 3, the mixed subtype, that's the most severe because they lack both. They lack both phonology and orthography. They have no usable key to unlock the reading code and pattern. This is the kid in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade reading on a 1st or 2nd grade level. Those were the big 3 we talked about last time. What we're going to talk about this time is not so much what happens with difficulty recognizing words. Back of the brain allows us to mechanically recognize the words. But I'm going to take you up front today. There we go. And let's talk about deriving meaning from print. And when you talk about deriving meaning from print, we're out of the back of the brain and we're into the world of the prefrontal cortex. Now, as we begin our discussion of some of the main attributes of reading comprehension skills, these are the attributes I really want to explore quite a bit today. The 4 main attributes to help us with subtype 4, which is reading comprehension. What we're going to talk about today is an emotional attribute, content affinity. 2 frontal lobe attributes, working memory and executive functioning. And then just having the core language foundational skills to derive meaning from print. What's the hardest thing about taking a course, let's say in high school, whether it's chemistry or physics or biology or, my goodness, maybe psychology? The terminology can be overwhelming. You have to have the language skills to support what you're reading. So if we take these one by one, the only thing that I'm going to mention about content affinity is that it matters to make an emotional connection with the information in print. Now, I've said this example before, but it's worth saying again. You've heard me say, I'm just outside of Washington, D.C., and I am a huge Washington Redskin football fan. I realize we have folks here from all over the country who now are just turning their head to the side, making a very, very ugly expression on their face when I acknowledge I'm a Redskin fan. I realize that. But it's the passion of the Redskins that I can read, that they signed a third-string tight end from Brigham Young University. I'll remember the guy's name and his 40-yard dash time. I'll remember everything about this trivial detail simply because of the passion and interest I have in my Washington Redskins. But you know what? If I'm reading about something, let's say, no, I won't be mean and say the Dallas Cowboys. Let's say we're reading about geology and igneous rocks. Well, that doesn't really capture the same emotional interest from me. It's very important. It does matter the amount of passion and emotional connectivity a student can have with the text in order to facilitate comprehension skills. The limbic system in our brain, that is really, and we talked about the limbic system in previous webinars and when we did emotional disorders, that's going to really help to enhance our ability to connect with the information, to begin to self-organize that information in a meaningful and useful way. It's when we're connected with the print. That's what we mean by content affinity. That's why every kid, to me, needs to be reading 20 minutes a day minimum on a topical subject that they enjoy, to be able to make an emotional connection to the print. Well, let's talk about the second construct that's involved with reading comprehension. Emotional connectivity. Second is going to be working memory. And the fact of the matter is, working memory is intimately tied in just about any aspect of learning. In fact, working memory, I think, is the most common processing deficit you see with all kids with learning disabilities. Why? Because it affects all the academic domains, probably more so in the area of written language than anything else. Because in written language, I have to simultaneously plan my thoughts, organize my thoughts, remember spelling rules and boundaries, recall grammar rules, concentrate on penmanship, capitalize the first word of the sentence, think about my word choice, always think about my penmanship, hold an ideal in mind when proofreading. There's just tons of stuff to remember simultaneously to keep in conscious awareness when engaged in the writing process. Many of our ADHD friends notoriously have difficulty with working memory, and many of our ADHD friends struggle in the writing process more than any other academic task. Planning and organizing, really hard to do when you cannot conjure and hold on to information in working memory. Working memory affects mathematics. We talked about this in an earlier webinar as well. Maybe not in the beginning years, kindergarten, first, second grade. We're learning single-digit addition, single-digit subtraction, single-digit multiplication. That can be memorized. But working memory really affects us when we get into longer math equations, division, 2- and 3-digit multiplication, working with fractions, decimals, when there's a math algorithm involved and there's 3, 4, 5 steps needed to problem solve. It goes beyond just rote memorization to know a single fact. That's more, it's not so much working memory. Working memory is you have to perform some mental gymnastics with the information. So in mathematics, it kind of affects us when we're actually in the act of problem solving that requires 3, 4, 5 steps. Often a problem that will require paper and pencil, and something we call it impacts math algorithms. But for our discussion today, working memory primarily impacts the reading area by way of comprehension. To be effective in passage comprehension, we have to simultaneously take in the new information while linking it up with previously read information and linking that up to our past background knowledge and experience. Again, that's where that emotional connectivity piece comes in. But working memory keeps all that in mind. It's a holding tank. It stores all of that. And there's many components of working memory in the brain. You see the phonological working memory loop is located more, and that's the brain you see on the left side of your screen. And that's going to affect more the language centers and acoustical centers of the brain. Let me see if I can get my marker working here. There we go. Back in here, more that temporal lobe area. There's a working memory that's a component that's called the visual spatial sketchpad. That's more on the right posterior part of the brain, back in the parietal lobe. That helps us with more spatial information. But the fact is, both loops, both the phonological loop and visual spatial sketchpad, work together to help us keep information, whether it's auditory and acoustical information or information that we've seen, visual spatial information. Wherever, it helps us keep it in the mind's eye by way of the central executive system, located bilateral, that means on the left and the right, frontal lobes, all the way up front. The frontal lobes dominate in terms of working memory. And we know that there's a couple of things that foul up the central executive system's ability to do its job and to coordinate the working memory process by working with the phonological loop and the visual spatial sketchpad. Command and control of working memory is in the frontal lobes. And what fouls up the prefrontal cortex's responsibilities with respect to working memory, anxiety, and emotional distress. I'm nervous about taking a test. I have an emotional condition like Martin. That was one of the first students we talked about. How does ED affect reading comprehension? Distress, emotional distress, anxiety, emotional conditions impact cognition by way of working memory. That's how it impacts. And we've all been there. We've all been so nervous that to try to, take a high-stakes test, we barely remember our first name, let alone the content of the information. Same thing with reading comprehension. Maybe you can automatically read the page. Have you ever been so preoccupied and worried that you're sitting there and you're trying to read a book, maybe to take your mind off of things, and you might read an entire page of text, get to the end and realize, I have no idea what I just read. Let's try that one again. See, the automatic pilot aspect of reading, sure, we can pull that off, but to derive meaning from print, that's frontal lobes, that's conscious awareness, and that starts with working memory. Anxiety and emotional distress impacts cognition by way of working memory. So working memory is kind of a learning facilitator. It's going to keep information in mind, while executive functioning, as we will see next, is the strategies we use to self-organize that information to facilitate later recall. However, you're not going to be able to self-organize what ain't there. And working memory allows us to keep the information fresh, active, and alive. Most ADHD kids and LD kids have limitations with working memory. And one thing that we need to stress for those WISC people out there, the WISC-4 is not a comprehensive measure of working memory. So what I'm saying is, if you're giving a WISC and say, look, it's got working memory, I can talk about working memory, I think only in the most superficial of ways. In other words, what is the WISC-4 working memory? You've got what? Digit span. But digits forward, that's not working memory. Johnny, 6, 5, 3, 4, say it back to me. That's immediate memory. Everyone's going to remember digits within a 2-second echoic trace. Anything beyond 2 seconds of space, then we assume someone used a working memory strategy to maintain the information and keep it active and alive. But the first 2 seconds is echoic memory. It's immediate memory. What about digits backwards? 7, 3, 4, 6. Say it in reverse order. Now, that's a working memory task because you have to do something with the information, perform some mental gymnastics with the information, work with the information. So I like digit span halfway because I like the digits backwards, but the WISC-IV has something called letter number sequencing. That's the second half. That's the other subtest to allow us a working memory score. Hey, Billy, come over here a minute. Billy, sit down. You know what, Billy? I'm going to say some numbers. I'm going to say some letters. Now, no matter what numbers what I say, always repeat back the numbers first and the letters. And when you repeat back the numbers, put them from lowest to highest. And when you repeat back the letters, always in alphabetical order. You got that, Billy? Jeez. You know what I'm saying. The working memory, you need to understand the directions is a mouthful. But you do a couple of practice ones. Billy's kind of got the hang of it. Somebody out there want to explain to me how come Billy can get it wrong? And it's still right on the protocol. All right, we'll get back to that. What I'm trying to say is this. To me, the WISC-IV working memory is a screener at best. My preference is to supplement that with working memory measures. Particularly, I like the WISC-IV integrated. I think the WISC-IV integrated with the visual digit span and the spatial span and the letter span. I like to use the integrated. It allows you to differentiate immediate initial registration, which is immediate memory, versus the ability to manipulate the information. And I like making that distinction. One is more tied in with attention deficits when you have deficits with immediate memory or the initial registration of information. But if it's more the manipulation of information, that's more working memory. I do like the WISC-IV integrated. I also like very much the PAL-2 verbal working memory subtest. So those are some other choices you could try. Also the RAML-2. Just the last couple of, you don't have to do the whole RAML. I mean, it's a pretty comprehensive memory test. But the last few subtests on there, you can also look at working memory. As again, there's an inverse relationship between anxiety and working memory skills. Generally, the more anxious and uncomfortable we are, the poorer our working memory is. Let's move in and talk about our third construct. We've talked about emotional connectivity to print. We've talked about the importance of working memory to the comprehension process. How about executive functions? Please tune in later this week to hear my good friend George McCloskey talk about executive functions in reading. But let's give a brief overview on executive functions in reading. As George will talk about, they are executive functions or directive capacities of the mind. There are multiple executive functions. It's not a single entity. Executive functions simply cue other regions of the brain of what to do when. Executive functions are routed through the frontal lobe. So again, both working memory and executive functions, frontal lobe measures. Executive function is not IQ. That's pretty important. So if we look at our brain, okay, it's not a perfect distinction here because an IQ test is a sloppy test. It's sloppy because it's a little bit of reasoning, a little bit of processing, a little bit of academic achievement, and a little bit of executive functioning all rolled up in one that we call IQ. We feel that IQ is primarily located back here. Let me see if I can get my marker to work. Hang on. Let's try pink. Whoops. Bear with me here. All right. Right back in here somewhere. If you see that, that's called the inferior parietal lobule. That means the underneath side of the parietal lobes where they interface with the occipital and temporal lobe. That's what Luria would call the highest area or tertiary area of reasoning. We think IQ is tapping more posterior parietal functioning. Okay? Take it to the bank. Executive functioning is up here. IQ back of the brain, executive functioning up front. Primarily in an area called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Now, when you look at the brain, the central sulcus is the dividing line right down here between the back of the brain, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobe, versus the front of the brain. About a third of our neocortex is the frontal lobe, but we got a big chunk of that frontal cortex called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and that's pretty much what we refer to when we talk about cognitive executive functions. Planning, organization, allocating time, sustaining attention. Cognitive executive functions, more dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Now, the point that I want to make is that if you're like me, and the only place you can test is the janitor's closet in the elementary school, and here I am dragging little Marie into the janitor's closet. Don't make any jokes. We sit down. We pull out the whisk and we start our testing. During that hour-and-a-half period, I am little Marie's prefrontal cortex. I tell little Marie what to do when. I allocate how much time to do it. When she's off task, I get her back on task. If she's struggling, I maintain motivational persistence. Marie, you're doing great. I'm so proud of you. Keep up the good work. All of those things. You are that kid's surrogate prefrontal cortex during testing, and especially during testing when you give examples of how to do a particular task. You're showing the kid the strategy, for Pete's sake. You have pretty much overtaken someone's prefrontal cortex as a tester. I don't know how much, quote-unquote, intelligence you need to be successful in school, to maintain, to push through a curriculum, and to get through it. Do you have to be a 90? Can you get through school as an 80? How about a 78? But the fact of the matter is, raw intelligence, rote intelligence, what we think we're measuring, more back at the brain. But the most important aspect to me is up front, and how you use your executive functions to channel that rote level intelligence in towards the pursuit of a goal-directed task. Quick story here. Remember back to one of the initial examples I gave of Joe, 135 IQ, 16 years old, failing grades. Do you know who Joe is? Joe is my older brother. Yes, and that's about what his IQ is. Because to this day, he could drag me into any conversation he wanted and grind me up and chew me up like a stone. But this is a true story. When Joe was 16 years old, Joe was in the 11th grade. Do you know what Joe set out to do? Joe thought it would be a really good idea. And it takes a brain of this magnitude to do this. That in his 5 core academic classes, what he wanted for the year was an A, a B, a C, a D, and an F. You got it? An A, a B, a C, a D, and an F. That was what he tried to get. And he got about halfway into the year, and his French teacher pulled him aside and said, "Hey, Joe, what are you doing here? I mean, I think you have the aptitude to do just fine in French, but you're really struggling. Now, I'll be more than happy to meet you halfway. Come after school, come in the morning, we'll work together, but I truly think you can pass my class." So the end of the year comes, and he was so incredibly mad and upset. He was livid because report cards came out. He had a full year's of work tied into this. And he ended up getting an A, a B, a C, and 2 Ds. His French teacher passed him. Now, he wasn't nearly as livid as my parents when they figured out what was going on. But I love my brother, but you don't want a classroom of Joes. You need a minimum threshold of IQ. I'll give you that to be successful in school. But beyond that, it's about executive functioning. It's about channeling that smarts towards a goal-directed task. to try your best every day, to be organized, to plan out what you're going to do, to allocate your time appropriately, to sustain your attention to task even when distracted, to persevere and not make the same mistake over and over again, but to try to be resourceful. These are all dorsolateral prefrontal cortex cognitive executive functions. And let's look at how they affect the reading process. Cognitive executive functions are helpful in planning. You want to read with a specific question or purpose in mind when seeking specific information. In other words, plan a strategy. That's how you comprehend. You have to plan a strategy. Organization is a dorsolateral prefrontal cortex attribute. Stitching together text in a cohesive manner and slotting information appropriately. Slotting information is huge. Okay? Kids with good comprehension skills naturally slot. Bob and Jim were walking to the bakery on a Sunday morning when Bob smelled some bread, fresh bread baking in the oven. Okay, Bob and Jim, slot those characters, Sunday morning, time of day, a bakery is the setting. Kids with good comprehension skills have the organizational capacity to slot on the fly. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes how you can determine who can slot and who cannot in just a couple of minutes. I like that. Slotting. Working memory, we've talked about. Concept formation, the depth of understanding of the text. Executive functioning and reading comprehension involves response inhibition. Concentration, refraining from jumping ahead when reading text and missing more salient aspects of the passage. How about our friend Martin, who had emotional impulsivity? He also struggled with response inhibition. This is how it affects comprehension. How about our first student that we talked about today? What was his name? I know his name was Billy. ADHD, sustained attention, the ability to stay focused on the text for prolonged periods of time and resisting distractions. How about cognitive flexibility? That's something that most of our Asperger's and autistic friends are not real strong on, and we talked about Sam as our 9-year-old example earlier. Shifting patterns of thought, processes, to the organizational parameters of the text being read, and not just perseverating on the same material and thoughts over and over again. Self-monitoring, staying aware and engaged in what you're reading while you're actually reading the information. These are executive functioning attributes. Now, hopefully, by looking at reading from this process side of working memory and executive functioning, you start seeing that it's not just isolated to kids with learning disabilities. ADHD kids, kids with low language skills, kids with poor executive functioning, kids who struggle with working memory. There are a lot of other disabilities that are going to struggle with reading comprehension. So these suggestions in terms of what we're going to do about it now is not just linked for kids with LD. This can be applied to anyone, and feel free to copy and paste and add this to your reports if you feel this is helpful. Number one, what are we going to do about it? Stop and start technique. I love it for ADHD kids. Have them read for 2 minutes, then say stop every 30 and ask them questions about what they just read. When they can consistently answer questions, you increase the interval by 30 seconds. It helps kids self-monitor what they're doing while they're doing it for prolonged periods of time. Directional questions. Why do we put the questions at the end of the text? Why not put them in the beginning of the text? Especially if I'm reading about something that, I'm reading about perhaps geology. I don't know what's salient, what's not salient. Directional questions. Okay, help me plan and organize what I need to kind of pay attention to and information perhaps I can discard. Might sound silly, but reading out loud facilitates working memory. Hearing your own voice linger longer allows you to apply a specific strategy to help you self-organize that information. We comprehend better reading out loud than reading silently. Story maps. Look, if I've got some executive dysfunction, I can't plan and organize and slot. Do it before you read. Pre-reading activities. Use graphic organizers to outline and organize the information. I remember for many years my son's bedtime story was Harry Potter, and we got up to, I don't know, for you Harry Potter guys out there, what, the fourth book, I think? Was that Goblet of Fire? Yeah, we got to about the fourth book, and wow, it was getting a little hard to comprehend, and my son one day made a story map about Harry Potter. He must have wrote down 40 different names with little arrows, okay, similar to what you see on the screen. Here's the book Harry Potter, here's the setting, the plot, and in the character space, he subdivided the character bubble there and listed them out, and arrows like connecting this person with that person, that Sirius Black is related to Bellatrix Lestrange and all that kind of stuff. But by laying that out in advance, we were able to get through Goblet of Fire because there were dozens and dozens and dozens of characters we were struggling to keep straight. Story maps can be very helpful planning out text. Narrative reading. Have the child retell a story after reading it out loud to begin the organization and synthesis process. Multiple exposures. One of the things we try to encourage students to do is to skim before reading, particularly looking at chapter headings and also topic sentences. Active participation, encouraging children to not be passive readers. Have them take notes. Put asterisks next to information. Use multiple colors for highlighting. Be careful with our ADHD friends because highlighting turns to page painting very quick. Got a little yellow here. Let me put a little more yellow there, and you fall into that trap. But sometimes highlighting characters with a yellow and, or I should say the protagonist with a yellow and the antagonist with the green, but color-coding highlighting can also help self-organize the information. Clearly, reducing anxiety will maximize working memory. One way to reduce anxiety, a lot of kids don't want to read out loud in class. That's a huge source of anxiety. Make reading out loud be optional. A lot of kids get real self-conscious about that real quick. Comprehension will be gone. You could say when all else fails, what about medication management? Well, that can be helpful for ADHD kids. That little white pill will allow you to focus. It does nothing to help you strategically self-organize the information. It can be, a facilitator, but I think we need a lot more than medication. Pulling out terminology and practicing it prior to reading the text is huge. We'll get into that. We're going to talk about vocabulary in a minute. Classroom discussions, every time you introduce a new topic, aimed at capturing a student's interest, providing them with background knowledge. What classrooms discussions actually do is allow students to engage or have a chance to develop an emotional connectivity with the text, and that was the first bullet point we talked about. Emotional connectivity, working memory, executive functioning, and then we're going to get to language in a minute. Clearly, fluency will help as well. The more fluent you are as a reader, the more automatic you are as a reader, that will free up cognitive resources in the frontal lobes to do what the frontal lobes need to be doing, and then it's to derive meaning from print. We showed this in our last webinar, that learning disabled kids use too much of their frontal lobes to help decode the information. That's got to be automatic. It's got to be back of the brain stuff, because it's got to free up the frontal lobes to do what they need to do, and that's to reflect, keep information in conscious awareness, and help us plan and organize and store information in a meaningful way to facilitate retrieval at a later date. You know what's hard? You know what's really hard? What's really hard is measuring executive functions. And as a profession, we're struggling. There's no question. I think for many years, we've had generic measures. The brief started it all. The behavior rating inventory of executive functioning. If you've never administered the brief, it's really quite easy. You write the student's name on the protocol, you tiptoe into the main office of a school, slip it in a teacher's box, and run away. Now you've just administered the brief. It's actually not too bad. It takes about 10 or 15 minutes to complete, but it's a very generic survey of executive functioning. You might want to consider Jack Naglieri and Sam Goldstein's new scale, the CEFI, Clinical Executive Functioning Inventory. I might have misspoke on that acronym, but it is the CEFI, and it is the newest executive functioning rating scale on the market. And there's some other ones on the market. Russell Barkley's got a new one on the market as well. In our neuropsych training program, we teach a test called the DCAS, the Dallas-Kaplan Executive Functioning Scale. There is the Wisconsin Card Sort test, test of executive control. I believe PAR puts that one out. The NEPSI-2 has executive functioning subtests. These are what I call generic measures. Let me tell you what I think is missing in our profession. Academic measures of executive function. Executive functioning is a big term. It's a big concept. I encourage you to listen to Dr. McCloskey later in the week, discuss it further. How we best capture it, to me, I think we need more academic executive functioning tests. There's no one on the market, but let me tell you what I like and what I tend to use. The California Verbal Learning Test. And if you haven't seen Pearson's Q Interactive system, you need to contact Pearson about Q Interactive, and they have California Verbal Learning Test on the Q Interactive, and it's pretty cool. There's still the paper and pencil version, which, most of us use, but it's neat that it's been computerized. California Verbal Learning Test is I'm going to read you a list of words. And you're going to be going to the store, and here's your shopping list. And I'm going to read you 15 words. And maybe the first time you repeat it back to me, you get 5 or 6. We do it 5 times. Now, by the fifth time, you ought to be telling me back, 12, 13 out of the 15 words, because it's the same list over and over. Then there's a few other tasks, some distracting tasks and so forth. But what the beauty of the California is that kids who can slot and have real good executive functioning skills, they recognize that all the words you say, all of them, are either a piece of fruit, an article of clothing, or a type of furniture. And you see, it's a whole lot easier to remember 3 categories than 15 isolated words that you can't see any connection between. And this is a computer-scored test, and in about 10 minutes, I know who can slot and who cannot. I give California to everyone I see. I really do. Because a good semantic recaller, that's what it calls it, semantic recaller, can slot effectively. On the other hand, if you can't recognize the categories to slot, the serial recaller tries to tell me back the information in the exact order that they hear it. And, that's difficult. And good luck trying to read a text and then remembering the information exactly word per word, 2,000 words later on what you just read. It's not an effective way to recall information. So I like the California. Tests like the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement at least allows you to make a distinction between kids better in comprehending literal information versus more inferential information. I do like the PAL-2. Again, with the PAL-2, that's more kindergarten through 6th grade. That's Virginia Berninger's test that is put out by Pearson. Some of the morphological and syntactic coding consists of a few different subtests. Are they related? Does it fit? Sentence structure. Are they related would be simply you read 2 words from the response booklet, and kids have to see if there's a connection in between them. Okay? So these tests kind of get a little bit into language relationships, language organization. I also big fan of the GORT. I've always been a GORT person, so I might compare comprehension on, let's say, a GORT 5, which is more read out loud, versus comprehension on, let's say, a Wyatt 3, so making that, which is more silent. and seeing if there's distinctions between the two. But you can see it's real tough. We don't really have a pure academic measure of executive functioning with reading. We have to infer it from the measures on the market. Probably best practice is to do one generic and one specific. Now, if you're looking for more programs to help children with reading comprehension, let's talk about a few. I very much like the Nancy Bell's Linda Mood Visualization and Verbalization program. This is a real effective program, great research supporting it for kids with autism, hyperlexia, kids that, we talked earlier about today. One of our cases was Sam, who had Asperger's. English language learners, lower verbal abilities. Basically, this is a way to use pictures and imaging, whether it's word imaging, sentence imaging, or multiple sentence imaging, eventually paragraph imaging, but it's allowing you to use your strength, which is thinking in pictures, to help us self-organize and remember verbal information, the Linda Mood Visualization and Verbalization program. We use this one quite effectively at the elementary level, SOAR to Success. SOAR actually teaches 4 key strategies, primarily for later elementary school, and the kids don't need to be on grade level, but if they're within shouting distance, that's pretty, that's good enough. It teaches kids how to summarize, clarify, question, and make predictions. It teaches you the executive functioning component of how to slot and how to self-organize. There's 5 key aspects. The kids will start out by rereading the story from before with a partner. A lot of story mapping and graphic organizers, which is another way to externalize executive functioning. If I can't do it intrinsically with my dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, I've got to externalize it on a piece of paper beforehand. Story mapping, graphic organizers. Rehearsing allows me to preview the text and begin learning how to make predictions. What cues and strategies do I use to make predictions about what's going to be read that day? There's reading exercising, and then the lesson concludes with reflection and a verbal discussion of the story. SOAR to Success, nice program to help kids with comprehension. Go through a couple of these quickly. You could certainly make the case that building fluency will increase comprehension as well. The less my prefrontal cortex has to think about the mechanical aspect of reading, the more it's freed up to do what it's supposed to do, and that's derive meaning from print. My favorite fluency building program is probably Read Naturally. And we did talk about Read Naturally last time. Very affordable. You don't have to be a highly trained reading specialist or go to lots of conferences to figure out how to use it. You can just order it and dive into it. The program is, each level of the program is 24 nonfiction stories, and it's about putting the headphones on and reading while listening to a reader read it with you. You graph your time and performance. The one thing I do want to mention about Read Naturally, it has comprehension responsibilities, but it doesn't teach actual comprehension skills. In other words, it's trying to allow you to be fluent and working on that. But before you can go to the next passage, you have to answer 5 comprehension questions to show that you're retaining comprehension and not just reading with blind speed and ignoring comprehension. So you have comprehension responsibilities, but nowhere in the program is it aimed at teaching comprehension strategies. But still a nice program to help with fluency. You see, I think one of the biggest issues and problems we have is just because kids are reading fluent, we assume they can comprehend. We assume that they can do it. And my point is sometimes they just have to be shown and taught the actual strategies. Read 180, we've talked about before. That's probably our best balanced literacy program on the market. More for older students, 90 minutes a day. It hits all aspects of reading and decoding. What I like about it is the computerized station builds into learning vocabulary words with the reading zone, and the success zone is the actual implementation and teaching of comprehension strategies. We've talked about this before. Read 180 is a phenomenal program to help kids in all aspects of reading. Biggest problem with Read 180, you got it, $30,000. Yep, very expensive. Well, we've talked about emotional connectivity to the text is important for comprehension, and ways to enhance that through discussions and pulling out background knowledge and so forth. We've talked about working memory. We've spent a lot of time talking about executive functioning, and Dr. McCloskey will talk more about executive functioning and reading in his next webinar. But the last aspect of reading comprehension we should probably discuss is vocabulary development. You have to have the language skills in place to derive meaning from print. Well, looking at language from a brain behavioral standpoint, here's a quick fact you can impress perhaps some of your friends with. At birth, the human brain only weighs 25% of its adult weight. That's it. Chimpanzee's brain, okay, 46%. And for you dog and cat lovers out there, you're at 70, 75%. What you see is what you get. But the human brain leaves a lot of room for growth, a lot of room to be shaped by the environment, by stimulation. And you know what? That human brain that just weighs 25% of its adult weight at birth, it weighs 95% of its adult weight at age 5 before that child even enters your building. And what is really, really vital and critical to helping that brain grow, and to grow a academic brain, a learning brain, a reading brain during those pivotal, important first 5 years, is exposure to the most linguistically enriched environment that we can offer. That is so critical to allow kids to prepare and to be ready for school. So a lot of people think of neuropsychology as, oh, it's so about the brain and neurons and you are what you are. No, if you study Luria, you recognize that, sure, the brain shapes the environment, but the environment shapes the brain. It's not either nature or nurture. It's a combination. It's a dance. That's really what it is. How do we shape a reading brain? Early enrichment, linguistic enrichment. Here's a study done by Joseph Torgerson. How'd you like to be the bean counter who participated in this? He said the average number of words spoken in a professional household is about 15 to 2,500 per day, or these kids have been exposed. They don't know, but they've been exposed to 3.5 million words by age 3. The average number of words spoken in a middle-class household, about 1,000 to 1,500. These kids have been exposed. They don't know, but they've been exposed to 2 million words by age 3. Average number of words spoken by a welfare mom, 500 to 800, 1 million words by age 3. Now, this is maybe not the most politically correct example, but what Torgerson was trying to show, and I think really try to lobby for, is the need for early intervention, especially for kids who might be at risk. And this is one reason to really help with more linguistic development. This is a study done by Sally Shaywitz. It comes from her book, Overcoming Dyslexia. And let me see if I can punch up my tool here. On the bottom it says this is the time spent reading each day. Now, if you're a kid and you read less than a minute per day, how do you do that? Don't you look at the Burger King sign out the window on the way home from school? Don't you look at something? All right, let's say you read a minute or less per day after school. You will be exposed to 8,000 words a year. Now, if you have, as a teacher, the audacity to assign 4.5 minutes of silent reading homework every night, 4.5 minutes, that child will be exposed to 282,000 words per year. But if you're a kid who reads 20 minutes a day after school, look at this. It goes up to almost 2 million words per year. We need all kids to be reading 20 minutes per day. That's the key to building, to getting better at reading. It's going to be the key to building their vocabulary development. It is absolutely critical. I'm not saying what they can read. Content, completely up to them. They want to read about professional wrestling or whatever, hunting, fishing, that's fine. 20 minutes a day. Look at the potential for vocabulary development. Keeping in mind the typical child enters school with a receptive vocabulary of 13,000 words, but according to Lise Elliott, an expressive vocabulary of some 5,000. Vocabulary is enhanced by both reading and talking to kids, conversing, maybe turning the television set off during dinner and having a conversation. It is very important we practice terminology before reading text, especially in the more challenging subjects when we get into middle and high school, more the science and technological subjects. The vocabulary will just bury you. Enhance depth through experiential learning and field trips to really develop, rather than memorize a term, but really develop an in-depth understanding of concepts. Help differentiate between students who struggle with inferences versus details. A reading comprehension test like the Kaufman Test of Educational Achievement, KTEA2, will help us with that. And always use classroom discussions to put words in a context. The brain loves context. Doesn't like rote memorization, but loves context. Well, final point to make, of course, we talk about the importance of fluency and comprehension. Let's just pause for a few seconds. Go ahead and read this. Can anybody read this? Anybody? I'll give you a few seconds to read that. I'll take a sip of water. Pretty amazing, huh? You see, as an adult reader, we average about 250 words per minute. That's 4 words a second, 1 word every 250 milliseconds. We are so automatic and fluent, we don't even have to put the words, or we don't even have to spell the words correctly, or even put the letters in the correct order. Our frontal lobes are so freed up because reading is automatic that we're in a position to decipher meaning from print even when we look at a passage and nothing is spelled correctly. And that's an approach we need to take with our kids. Not only get reading and put them in a position where reading is automatic, but also teach this core strategies to help them self-organize verbal information. Quick example, quick little case here. In our remaining, I think we have about 6 or 7 minutes. One of the reasons our cause and effect webinars, I think, have been relatively popular is folks have recognized some of the limitations of looking at learning simply through the lens of an IQ test only. And if we look at learning through the lens of an IQ test only, we tend to look at kids as being nothing more than numbers. Here's their IQ, here's their achievement. Do they qualify? What do you think? Look at Bobby. What do you think? You know, most people would look at that profile and say full scale IQ is 87, reading 86, math 96, writing 92. What's the problem? What's the problem? His achievement is right where his full-scale IQ is, and if that's our interpretation, we're being fooled. We're being misled. It's time to turn the page. The United States Supreme Court even recognized this now, that to truly understand learning, we have to widen the lens. IQ scores have too many blind spots. And how do you widen the lens? You give tests of processing. and you give tests of processing related to the reading process. We're not going to survey every higher cortical functioning skill. We're going to survey the ones that are important to reading. And now we're looking at Bobby, and we're like, holy cow! You know, his phonics skills look a little rough there. Now we look at Bobby, and we look at some of the executive functioning and verbal working memory components related to reading by way of the PAL-2. It looks a little rough there. And if you back up, let me back up one slide, and you look at the IQ performance. Look, this is the hot spot for reading. I don't care what the full scale IQ is. I've said this a lot, a million times. Yeah, if it's below 75, sure, I'm interested. Above 120, yeah, I'm interested. But most kids score in that morass of mediocrity. It's the factor scores. And what are the factor scores that are really important in reading? Verbal IQ and working memory. Look at the weakness on Bobby. Verbal IQ, working memory. Anybody want to take a bet after our last discussion he's going to have some reading comprehension problems? Verbal IQ, working memory. Now, what we've done that is layered some of the executive functioning component by trying to tease that out by way of the PAL, verbal working memory. Let me get my marker here. We've given the GORT-5, and we've noticed some comprehension issues in the GORT-5. We've already established verbal working memory is very, very limited. His weakest area was working memory on the WISC anyway. You gave a test like the California Verbal Learning Test, no semantic recall. He doesn't slot at all. We got the executive functioning issues in general shown with the brief, but then when we went specific with the California, it's also related specifically to reading. He doesn't slot. We got the double whammy here, guys. What combination do we have? We got a kid with poor executive functioning. We got a kid with working memory limitations. We got a kid with some language issues. And, yeah, his reading fluency isn't exactly top of the charts either. It's a little slow. Bobby needs help. You want to call it special ed, non-special ed, doesn't matter to me. Kid needs help. Bobby probably needs a more highly structured type of reading program. We talked about some of these programs last time, but what we're adding to it is not just to help him with phonology, but to play into some of his strengths, which seems to be the visual, spatial component. Horizons Fast Track is actually a visual phonics program, but teaching him strategies to comprehend, sort of success. You know, how to do a story map, a graphic organizer, how to make predictions. Great Leaps is a nice, quick program to help with the fluency end, because the more fluent he can become, the more that can free up the frontal lobes to do what the frontal lobes do best, and that is to self-organize the information for the purpose of later retrieval. You can always pull in curriculum-based measurement to monitor and track progress. So just a quick case to kind of begin to exit us out of this webinar. There's one last thing that I would like to mention in our remaining minute and a half. For those of you who have continued to join us throughout the year with our Cause and Effect webinar series, and for those of you who really appreciate the style in which we take this from using principles of neuropsychology and processing to help tease out learning in children, and hopefully what my emphasis has been to link that to interventions that can be targeted and individualized. I do want to mention that if you are interested in doing further training in neuropsychology, as Andrea said in the introduction, I am a clinical supervisor in the School Neuropsychology Postgraduate Certificate Program. That is a one-year training program for school psychologists, whether you are trained at the master's, EDS, or doctorate level. It does not matter. You need to be a certified school psychologist. If you are interested in how you can use elements of processing, executive functioning, working memory, and so forth to tease out reading, writing, math, emotional disorders, to go further in your assessments and to go further in your interventions, but you want to remain in your schools, you want to work with kids. It's not a program that's you're going to go into if you want to work in a hospital or rehab center, but it's a school neuropsych training program. I would encourage all of you to go to this website, www.neuropsychology, www.schoolneuropsych.com. That is www.schoolneuropsych.com. You'll also find Dr. Miller's email address, who's the program coordinator, www.schoolneuropsych.com. If you are interested, and perhaps I might be your supervisor for this upcoming year in the area of school neuropsychology. And with that said, I hope this webinar was very helpful in your important work with children. I wish you all a good day. Thank you for joining us.